This series begins by showing a woman and a man disguised as a married couple named John and Jane Smith, who are enjoying their time at their hideout on the edge of the forest. Before long, a car suddenly approaches, prompting both of them to prepare weapons to face the incoming enemy. During the preparation, John is shot dead, prompting Jane to recklessly leave the house and confront the enemy directly, although she also gets shot and killed by the enemy. On the other hand, a woman claiming to be of Japanese-Scottish descent is seen conducting an interview using a machine called He. In addition to answering various questions displayed on the system screen, the woman also inserts nail clippings into the machine and declares herself ready to be assigned anywhere, as she claims to have previously undergone CIA recruitment but failed due to her antisocial nature. After the interview with the woman concludes, a black-skinned man also undergoes the entire interview process with the He machine, during which he reveals himself to be of African-American descent with skills in unarmed combat and military training. A while later, both of them are accepted as secret agents who will disguised as a married couple named John and Jane Smith. After that, they proceed to a house that will serve as their residence during the mission, and to perfect their disguise, John and Jane also acquire new identities, including weapon permits and wedding rings. In their first mission assigned by the He system, they are tasked with seizing a package carried by a woman and delivering it to a location according to the coordinates provided. As per the mission execution rules, neither John nor Jane is allowed to ask anything, including details about the identity of the woman they are to follow. After reading the mission details, John and Jane, who have just met, choose to rest in separate rooms. To avoid feeling lonely, Jane is seen bringing her pet cat with her, while John, curious about his work partner, tries to search the internet using Jane's photo. But John finds no digital trace of Jane whatsoever. The next morning, the two secret agents began to tail a woman known as Marla, who was meeting someone at a restaurant. In the midst of the surveillance, John and Jane, who were focused on observing Marla, were suddenly startled by a restaurant waiter dropping a plate near them. Fortunately, this did not arouse Marla's suspicion of John and Jane, who were spying on her. Seeing Marla still chatting casually, Jane attempted to strike up a conversation with John discussing their recruitment through the He system aimed at minimizing defection like the old tactics employed by the Russian intelligence agency. When John inquired about Jane's real name, Jane refused to provide that information, including details about her previous missions. After seeing Marla leave the restaurant, John and Jane immediately followed her to a park, where John informed Jane that he was a former military special forces soldier. Meanwhile, Jane only admitted to having been a former secret agent, although once again she did not elaborate on her work before meeting John. As they continued chatting, they kept an eye on Marla, who had not yet been seen carrying the package that John and Jane were supposed to steal. Not long after, Marla resumed her journey, prompting John and Jane to follow her to a train station, even trailing her onto a train. When Marla got off at a station, John and Jane finally exchanged phone numbers as they decided to split up, with Jane following Marla, who appeared to enter a theater show, while John waited outside the theater building. At that moment, Jane seemed momentarily embarrassed, thinking John was going to caress her cheek, when in fact John just wanted to put earphones in Jane's ears. Despite the momentary awkwardness, they both quickly focused on carrying out their mission by splitting up to their respective positions. After successfully entering the theater show venue, Jane immediately informed John about her position, even discussing herself and her friends who had breakfast with a man who has a weird sexual desire. But luckily, Jane and her friends did not become victims of the man's crimes. A few moments later, Jane followed Marla, who had just exited the show building carrying a box, and at the same time, John tried to find a way to snatch the box from Marla. When Marla was seen entering a cell phone store to buy a new phone that she would use to contact someone, John quickly bought a cardboard box which he filled with a doll. After that, he handed the box to Jane because John attempted to create a commotion in the street, where Marla was passing through, so that Jane could easily swap the box. Without wasting time, John and Jane delivered the package box using a train to the coordinates that the He system had determined. During the journey, they discussed the He system's demand for them to cut ties with anyone, including family, if they were assigned as secret agents. John expressed his difficulty with this requirement, as he would have to separate from his mother, who was the only living member of his family. Upon arriving at the delivery location, which was a luxurious house, they handed the package to a woman who seemed pleased, as if she had been waiting for a package containing cakes. Despite feeling strange about it, John and Jane hurriedly left the luxurious house, since they were prohibited from discussing all aspects of the mission they had just completed. Just as they both left the house, an explosion suspected to originate from the cake they delivered occurred. Without hesitation, the fake husband and wife duo fled from the suspicion of the police. Luckily, they managed to evade police pursuit by hiding in a place before finally returning home. In the evening, various online news portals reported on an explosion at a luxurious house that killed 9 occupants. John and Jane, aware of this, seemed to have anticipated it even before they accepted the offer to become secret agents. That's why they rested and tried not to regret the job they had taken. The next morning, Jane, who had just returned from shopping, was approached by her neighbor named Harris, who complained because Jane's cat had defecated in Harris's yard. The young man also asked several questions, including about Jane and John's jobs. Unbeknownst to them, John observed Jane and Harris from inside the house, appearing familiar despite just meeting. When Jane entered the house, John warned her not to get too close to others, seemingly jealous, especially after Jane found Harris attractive. John reasoned that their job carried high risks, so they always had to be cautious around new people. Upon hearing this, Jane felt that John was jealous even though he didn't admit it, and they both agreed to remain professionally committed to their job without any intimacy until their job was done. On another occasion, John and Jane received their next mission from the He system, instructing them to attend a silent auction and inject 1 dose of truth serum into the target. When the target revealed all truths in public, Jane and John had to record all the information conveyed by the target. In this mission, the He system urged John and Jane to be careful in completing the mission to avoid casualties or witnesses, thus preventing new problems. In the evening, John and Jane went to an auction event in a building, and to have more freedom of movement, John decided to work as a waiter at the event. Meanwhile, Jane entered alone as a guest who would pretend to bid on auction items. Before attending the auction event, Jane went to the restroom to hide the truth serum carried behind her dress. Shortly after, Jane joined other guests to participate in the auction event by scanning the barcode on each displayed item. At the same time, John roamed around pretending to offer wine while reporting the bidding prices offered by the guests to Jane through the communication device they both used. After observing several guests, John finally noticed an elderly man named Eric Shane bidding on a pearl necklace reaching $106 million. Realizing that Eric was the target of their mission that night, John attempted to converse with the real estate businessman, who was known to have no partner despite having a net worth of up to $15 billion. Feeling unsuccessful in approaching Eric, John then invited Eric to a private room so that John and Jane could complete their mission. While in a room, Eric appeared to give John a sum of money while asking John and Jane, who accompanied him to the room, to act like pet dogs. Despite feeling awkward about Eric's request, John and Jane still did it and took advantage of Eric's carelessness to inject the truth serum into the elderly man. Due to a lack of communication, the 2 secret agents injected 1 dose of serum each, although the He system had previously instructed them to administer only 1 dose of serum. As the result, the excessive dosage of serum nearly caused Eric to lose consciousness, and he staggered out of the room and fled. In the auction room, Eric unwittingly revealed his dark side in front of all the attending guests. John and Jane immediately recorded the incident as instructed by the He system and then escorted Eric out of the auction room, attempting to revive the elderly man who was now unconscious due to the excessive effects of the truth serum. Unfortunately, John and Jane's efforts failed as they couldn't save Eric's life. After that, they intended to dispose of Eric's body, and to avoid suspicion from others, the 2 secret agents were forced to break Eric's legs so they could fit him into a trash bag, which they then disposed of in a trash bin. At that moment, John and Jane appeared to feel guilty about Eric's death, which they had not planned at all. The next morning, as the mission was considered completed, John sent a message to the He system to report the casualty in that night's mission. At the same time, Jane put 2 marbles into a bottle as a marker that she and John had completed 2 missions given. Unexpectedly, the He system considered John and Jane to have failed in completing the mission to administer the truth serum to Eric, so they still had 2 remaining missions to complete. With the failure of the mission, the 2 secret agents became more open, eventually breaking their agreement and sleeping together. In the next mission, John and Jane went to the Italian Dolomites to surveil and report on the activities of a married couple named Gavel and Parker Martin, who lived next door to the room occupied by John and Jane. In addition to installing surveillance cameras, they were assigned to tap the phones of the married couple. Every day, the two secret agents observed all the activities of Gavel and Parker, including when the couple were arguing. At that moment, the surveillance was done casually, so John and Jane became closer. The next morning, the plan to tap Gavel and Parker's phones was carried out when the couple were going skiing, one of Parker's hobbies. At the same time, John and Jane conducted surveillance while Gavel and Parker were still at the restaurant at the ski location. They then followed the targets using a cable car to the snowy mountains, and on the way, Jane was surprised to see John receiving a call from his mother. Jane immediately reminded her work partner not to violate the rules set by the he system because John's continued connection with his family would endanger him and his mother. Upon hearing this, John argued that he couldn't simply ignore his mother, especially since she was the only family he had. Despite this, Jane still disagreed with John's actions, leading to a brief argument between them. Shortly after getting off the cable car, John, who had separated from Jane, intended to follow Parker and his family, who were starting to snowboard, but John seemed to have difficulty snowboarding, making it hard for him to carry out surveillance. Fortunately, Parker's family returned to the restaurant with their son, allowing John and Jane to conduct surveillance more easily. At that moment, Parker and Gavel appeared to resume their argument about something until Gavel, irritated, left her husband and child. Quickly, John followed Gavel, who went alone to the sauna to calm down. Unfortunately, John seemed to have difficulty approaching Gavel because she was busy with her phone and ignored John's presence. Meanwhile, Jane was tasked with approaching Parker so she could tap his phone. Returning to John, who had left the sauna, he attempted to chat with Gavel again, even intentionally ordering a bowl of rice claiming it was to dry Gavel's phone. This gesture touched Gavel to the point where she began to open up and confide her marital problems to John. At the same time, Jane succeeded in getting Parker to talk about his issues. When Jane noticed Parker's son always busy playing online games, she suggested Parker install his son's favorite game to bond better with him. Jane even borrowed Parker's phone to help him install the game, and it was during this opportunity that Jane tapped Parker's phone using a special device. On the other hand, John also managed to tap Gavel's phone by helping her turn it on after he placed it in the bowl of rice. Not long after, John was startled by Gavel's screams, who had previously asked to go to the bathroom. After John went to the source of Gavel's voice, she appeared to be kidnapped by several mysterious men who forced her into a vehicle. At the same time, Jane overheard Parker's conversation on the phone with the kidnappers who threatened to kill Gavel if Parker didn't immediately release all his shares in the company. Upon seeing his son, Parker decided to refuse the kidnappers' demands even if it meant sacrificing Gavel's life. At the same time, Jane, who also received news of Gavel's kidnapping from John, reminded John not to interfere with the situation. However, John couldn't bear to let Gavel, who had a son, become a victim, so he eliminated the kidnappers and managed to get Gavel out before they could take her away. As a result, the surviving kidnappers immediately pursued and attacked John. Unfortunately, Jane did not assist John, who was involved in a shootout with the kidnappers. Instead, she expressed her frustration to John until she realized that John was truly in danger, prompting her to follow him. Upon arrival at the scene, Jane found John badly beaten and cold. Meanwhile, Gavel returned to the room and met Parker safe. Back to Jane, who had taken John to the room, she immediately soaked him in warm water until John recovered before they finally returned home by train as their mission was deemed completed. Sometime later, John and Jane were seen at the market where John accidentally met his ex-girlfriend, Rooney. John was seen chatting with Rooney to catch up after not seeing each other for a long time. At the same time, Jane appeared jealous of the intimacy between John and Rooney. Shortly after, Jane was approached by Harris, who happened to be shopping at the market, so they chatted until John, noticing this, became annoyed with their closeness. While John was still watching Jane chatting with Harris, a juice vendor suddenly called out John's name to pick up a fruit juice order. John found this strange because he hadn't ordered juice before, until a man with the same name as John admitted that he was the one who ordered the drink. Because of this incident, John and Jane got acquainted with the man, who turned out to be a senior secret agent, and he also had a partner named Jane Smith. After that, John and Jane were surprised to learn that there was another Smith couple assigned as secret agents like them. To get to know the senior Smith couple, Jane then invited them for dinner at home. That night, when the Smith couple came to the house, Jane happily showed them around her home, including the collection of weapons provided by the he system for their missions. After touring around, the four of them finally sat down to enjoy the dinner prepared by John and Jane while discussing personal matters, the missions they received, and the company that gave them various missions. At that moment, John and Jane admitted that they had developed romantic feelings for each other, despite previously agreeing not to fall in love while carrying out missions from the he system. Upon hearing this, the senior Smith couple laughed at John and Jane for breaking the agreement they made. When John and Jane asked about the most difficult mission from the he system, the senior Smith couple recounted that they once had a mission in Bali, Indonesia, where they had to free a target from a high-security location without using communication devices or weapons. After that, they advised John and Jane to stay calm and trust their instincts in every difficult mission because they almost killed another Smith couple while completing a mission. The senior Smith couple then invited John and Jane to join a high-risk mission they would undertake that night. Feeling challenged by the mission, John and Jane agreed to join the senior Smith couple. Without wasting time, the senior Smith couple immediately invited John and Jane to depart using a helicopter, but after John and Jane boarded, the senior Smith couple asked their juniors to complete the mission without them. Although John and Jane were surprised, they still set off to carry out the mission that should have been completed by the senior Smith couple. After a fairly long journey, John and Jane were dropped into a war zone in the forest where they had to leave their phones in the helicopter, which would return to pick them up in 30 minutes. Therefore, John and Jane had to complete the mission before the helicopter arrived so they could return home. Not long after, they descended and unfortunately, were captured by an armed group that controlled the forest. John and Jane were taken to a shack, but with their martial arts skills, the junior Smith couple managed to defeat the kidnappers. 30 minutes later, John and Jane appeared to be in the helicopter with bloodied faces after engaging in a brawl with the kidnappers. John, feeling irritated, contacted the senior Smith couple who were quite impressed with John and Jane's abilities for successfully completing the difficult mission. As an apology, the senior Smith couple gave all the payment for the mission to John and Jane, and without much delay, Jane displayed a sum of money that had been deposited into their payment account. From the amount of payment, they learned that the payment would increase depending on the difficulty level of the mission. Upon arriving home, John and Jane immediately cleaned themselves up and were seen resting together after completing the super high-risk level mission from the senior Smith couple. In the next mission, John and Jane were seen wearing face coverings while apprehending Toby Hellinger, a drug addict who needed protection because he had important information for the company where John and Jane worked. They then took Toby, who also had his head covered, into a car and headed to a safe location designated by the he system. During the journey, Toby confessed feeling suffocated and recounted having suffered a heart attack due to difficulty breathing, so Jane was forced to remove Toby's head covering. At the same time, they were attacked by individuals pursuing their car and targeting Toby. While shooting at the car behind them, Jane wondered why so many people wanted to kill Toby, but he remained silent after previously consumed drugs. When John and the others reached the safe house, another group also launched an attack, forcing them to take Toby away from the location again. To evade the pursuit of the mysterious criminal group, John directed the car into a busy alley, prompting Jane to fire shots into the air to clear the way. Feeling increasingly cornered, Jane and John took Toby out of the car and attempted to escape from the criminal group through narrow alleys. After John and Jane successfully eliminated the gang of criminals targeting Toby, John invited Jane and Toby to continue the journey using a speedboat to a private villa on the lakeside. Unexpectedly, the house turned out to have been secretly bought by John without Jane's knowledge, intending it as a romantic surprise for her. Upon hearing this, Jane didn't expect John to be so romantic towards her. While keeping an eye on Toby, Jane then sent a message to the he system to report that the safe house prepared by the company had been discovered by intruders, prompting the he system to instruct Jane to wait for further instructions. In the conversation, the he system asked if Jane enjoyed her job as a secret agent working with John. The he system also noted that the company evaluated Jane had been doing her job well. Jane was quite surprised to read this, especially since the company had never discussed this matter before. That night, Jane received another notification from the he system that a plane would pick them up at the lake. Although Jane hadn't disclosed their whereabouts, it seemed that the company could easily determine their location. The next day, John and the others were surprised by the appearance of the criminals around the villa, so they immediately slipped away using the speedboat. When Jane saw the criminals had entered the house, she detonated the villa. After that, they continued the journey using the speedboat until a seaplane came to pick them up. Upon arriving home, John suddenly brought up the topic of wanting a child. But Jane disagreed because they still had missions to complete for the company they worked for. This disappointed John, especially after he received a bottle of champagne from the company praising Jane's performance. Angrily, John handed the champagne bottle to Jane and left, feeling unappreciated by the company. Meanwhile, Jane received a message from the he system asking if she wanted to change her working partner. On another day, the issues regarding John and Jane's relationship seemed to become more complicated, so they went to a psychologist named Rita for counseling. To avoid raising suspicion, they pretended to be a married couple working as software engineers at a company. During the counseling session, John expressed his desire to have a child, but Jane refused, citing the challenging and high-responsibility nature of their work. Rita, upon hearing Jane's explanation, was puzzled because being a software engineer wasn't a high-risk job threatening lives. Jane and John couldn't explain their actual jobs and only remembered some missions that worsened their relationship. One of them was when John was on a mission to eliminate gangsters, so he disguised himself as a gang member and played card games with the target. Unfortunately, before John could complete his mission, Jane, who was prepared from a distance with her rifle, shot the target dead, making John upset with Jane's aggressive action because he wanted to eliminate the gangsters in his own way. Meanwhile, Jane argued that she was only trying to save John's life, which he believed was in danger. Back to the present, Rita, who had listened to all of John and Jane's grievances, finally suggested that they both travel to natural tourist destinations to calm down. Upon walking home, John and Jane laughed at Rita's advice because they felt she didn't provide the best solution at all. On the other hand, the two secret agents embarked on a mission to capture a man who was their target. At that moment, Jane was seen chasing the target into an elevator, even engaging in a brawl with the man. Meanwhile, John, who didn't make it into the elevator, was forced to chase Jane and the target through the emergency stairs up to the 16th floor, leaving him out of breath. Shortly after, Jane had reached the rooftop of the building, defeated the target, and thrown him off the rooftop. But John just laughed at Jane for her rough language and frustration with the difficult-to-catch target. This caused them to quarrel again, further straining their relationship. Similarly, in another mission, John and Jane had to complete a mission in the forest, but unfortunately, they both got lost and couldn't get a cell phone signal, leaving Jane frustrated. Meanwhile, John was not worried at all about their situation of being unable to return. In fact, he enjoyed fishing in the lake using his rifle. Upon seeing this, Jane became increasingly annoyed with John's behavior, seeming reluctant to think about a way out of the problems they were facing. The dispute between them escalated further into the night after Jane found out that John kept contacting his mother, even labeling his emergency box with his mother's name, whereas Jane labeled hers with John's name. As their relationship deteriorated after the mission, they consulted Rita again about all the things they were facing. From all the complaints John and Jane voiced, Rita suggested that the married couple work separately to reduce disputes between them. Before ending the counseling session, Rita provided them with recordings of their entire conversation from the cameras installed in various corners of the counseling room. John and Jane accepted the recordings and bid farewell. Unexpectedly, they set Rita's house on fire to eliminate evidence of the recordings that could potentially expose their secrets as secret agents. Sometime later, John and Jane decided to complete their respective missions, and they even went back to sleeping in separate rooms as when they first met. One morning, while John was playing Kendama to pass the time, Jane, who appeared to have a cold, quietly went to the home of a black woman named Bev, who had recently become John's date. Without suspicion, Bev offered Jane a drink, then pulled out a firearm, questioning Bev about her relationship with John. Bev admitted that she had only known John for a month, during which they had become close friends, spending time together watching movies or chatting. Bev also revealed that she knew John and Jane were secret agents working together on missions for a company. In her confession, Bev also mentioned how John felt troubled by Jane's controlling nature. Amidst their conversation, the doorbell suddenly rang and Jane, realizing that John had arrived, quickly hid and threatened to kill Bev if she disclosed Jane's presence to John. After John entered the house, he immediately went to the kitchen to get ice cream and chatted with Bev. Upon seeing this, Jane felt jealous of their closeness, prompting John to suddenly ask Bev about Jane's whereabouts. Realizing she was being set up by John, who had a mission to eliminate her, Bev immediately resisted. At that moment, Jane was confused by what was happening, but John quickly asked Jane to attack Bev so they could complete the mission from He system as soon as possible. When John and Jane thought Bev was dead, Bev suddenly attacked John from behind using a special choke wire, causing John to panic and try to find something to cut the wire around his neck. Meanwhile, Jane engaged in a fight with Bev, who eventually managed to escape. After that, Jane immediately helped John, who was struggling to breathe, by cutting the binding wire. Fortunately, John survived, although his neck was injured due to the wire from Bev. Without wasting time, John urged Jane to quickly chase after Bev because he had secretly placed a tracker on Bev's clothing while pretending to massage her earlier. After that, they both followed Bev's location, which appeared to be at a train station. When Bev realized that John and Jane were pursuing her, she quickly boarded a train to evade the couple. Unfortunately, John and Jane failed to make the capture after the train doors closed, and Bev had already boarded the train. At the same time, John's phone battery had also died, preventing them from immediately pursuing, so they decided to stop by a mini-market to recharge John's phone battery. During that time, Jane expressed her frustration to John for being too close to Bev despite knowing that Bev was John's mission target. At that moment, they had a brief argument before John's phone could be turned back on, and they were able to track Bev's whereabouts again. After John sent the coordinates to Jane, they hurried to a restaurant and realized that Bev had planted the tracker in front of the restaurant. Having failed to capture the target, John and Jane chose to return home. With the failure to apprehend Bev, they had now failed 3 times on their missions, so He system only instructed them to wait for further instructions. That night, John also revealed his intention to leave Jane because of their constant arguments. Angered with this, Jane was seen throwing her laptop until it broke. The next day, a courier suddenly arrived at Jane's house to deliver a new laptop from the company. Jane was surprised because she had just destroyed her laptop the night before, and she began to suspect that her house was equipped with hidden cameras, allowing the company to know what happened to her while inside the house. On another day, Jane received a new mission from He system, but Jane didn't expect that she would be tasked with killing John. Before leaving to carry out the assigned mission, Jane took the time to feed her cat until she was startled by several shots from outside aimed at her. Jane immediately hid to avoid the shots, but unfortunately, her cat became the victim of the mysterious shooter. At that moment, Jane suspected that John had known about her assignment to kill him, so John intended to eliminate her first. Meanwhile, John was seen escorting his mother, Denise, who had just returned from shopping, and noticed that his front door was wide open. Feeling suspicious, John then asked Denise to enjoy her time by going to the salon, while John began to inspect the door and saw a booby trap that had been set up and connected to explosives. At that moment, John believed that all of this was Jane's doing in anger towards him. Therefore, John sent a message to Jane asking them to meet at a museum and discuss the matter. When they were at the museum, John and Jane tried not to cause a scene due to their argument. So Jane intentionally trapped John at the museum's exit by wedging the revolving door with a knife and leaving an explosive that could eliminate him. Calmly, Jane walked away from the museum, while John tried to save himself from the explosion. Fortunately, John survived and then chased after Jane, who had deliberately tried to kill him. They then got into a fight in a crowded city park, with many people trying to break them up, but John and Jane ended up beating those people until the police arrived intending to arrest them. Quickly, John and Jane tried to escape from the police pursuit, so John's plan to find out if Jane really had feelings for him ultimately failed. During the escape, John was hit by a car, causing Jane to worry, but after seeing John regain consciousness and get back up, Jane decided to return home where she was surprised by Denise's presence, as if she knew there was a problem between John and Jane. Meanwhile, John came home battered, so he told Harris that he had just fallen from the balcony, and since his house was locked from the inside, he asked Harris for help to get inside through Harris's roof. Back at Jane's house, before leaving, Denise told Jane that John was a responsible man. At Harris's house, John secretly searched Harris's room until he found a photo of himself and Jane, leading John to suspect that Harris had evil intentions towards John and Jane's marriage. When John pointed a gun at him, Harris confessed that he was a real estate salesman studying John's house, which Harris found quite interesting. After hearing this, John chose to let Harris go and returned home, where he was greeted by Jane. A shootout between John and Jane ensued, leaving their house in shambles. Shortly after, John seemed to try to incapacitate Jane so they could discuss their issues. Unfortunately, Jane's martial arts and shooting skills made it difficult for John to apprehend her. With no other choice, John finally threw Jane with a flower vase until she passed out, and John quickly tied her up. When Jane regained consciousness, John injected them both with a truth serum so they would confess their true selves. At that moment, Jane confessed to being a sociopath, which caused her to fail to enter the CIA. In their confession, they both revealed their love for each other, realizing that there were others trying to kill them. Not long after, the Smith Sr. couple entered the house, as they were the ones assigned by the company to eliminate John and Jane. They also confessed to having eliminated other Mr. and Mrs. Smith couples when those Smith couples had issues. The Smith Sr. couple admitted that the super high-risk mission John and Jane previously undertook was part of the punishment for the Smith couple who failed to complete their missions. When the Smith Sr. couple let their guard down, quickly, John and Jane grabbed their weapons and managed to injure their seniors. To avoid the Smith Sr.'s attack, they both ran to the safe room where Jane realized that John had been shot. In that situation, Jane finally agreed to John's request to have a child and prepared to face the Smith Seniors even though Jane only had one bullet left. In the end scene, it is shown from outside the building of John and Jane's house. 3 shots appear to have been fired without knowing for sure whether Smith Jr. survived from Smith Sr. or not. Moral lesson from the story: never bring a rice bowl to a snowboarding mission. But when it comes to love and secret missions, sometimes it's best to trust each other instead of firing shots, especially when dealing with a nosy neighbor who's into real estate.